welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Jung-cho. The Trump administration is making clear it will not agree to an incremental and step-by-step approach to North Korea's denuclearization. North Korea, in response, threatens to resume nuclear and missile tests. Today, we take a look at how things will unfold in the coming weeks.
We are not going to do denuclearization incrementally. The president has been clear on that.
These sanctions are the world sanctions, and that they will be maintained until denuclearization is achieved.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner was CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Also joining me, Mr. Mark Fitzpatrick, Associate Fellow and former Executive Director of IISS Americas. Mr. Fitzpatrick was Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Non-Proliferation at the State Department. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Now, North Korea's Vice Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee says that Chairman Kim will soon make a decision whether to continue the moratorium on missile testings and nuclear testings. So why didn't North Korea just go ahead and test? Why give prior warnings?
Oh, I think this is a better way of playing it for them. You know, they are very frustrated at what happened, what didn't happen in Hanoi. And then they heard National Security Advisor John Bolton threatening more sanctions. So they're responding to a threat with a threat of their own. And if the United States imposes new sanctions, I think we may see then some kind of another missile test.
Mm-hmm. What is it?
I agree. I think this is more of a shot across the bow of the U.S. and diplomatic attempts to solve the denuclearization problem. I think some will depict it as a threat. At this point, I think it's more still of a small caliber shot across the bow. Is the sort of a slow motion, stop me before I do something bad, and you can stop me by offering what I would have liked to have gotten in Hanoi.
Isn't this what exactly the U.S. side had concerned that North Korea may do this? Because Special Representative Began visited the UN Security Council and asked China and Russia to help North Korea not go the other way.
Right. And for the president, he's clearly laid out for him a red line would be testing. You know, he said he's happy as long as they're not testing, even if they continue to produce nuclear weapons and continue to refine them. So if North Korea, along with this threat by Madam Che, we've also seen activity at the Sohae launch facility. Again, kind of a slow motion, stop me from doing something. They've refurbished some of the buildings, perhaps indications of a missile being prepared. But again, it's a slow motion trying to, I think, pressure the U.S. to come back to the table in the way that North Korea would like.
So is North Korea not considering leaving the talks altogether, do you think?
No, I think it would be very unwise for them to think about leaving the talks altogether. You know, I think they may well slow down for a while. And in fact, they had been before the Hanoi summit. You know, there were many months last year when Choi Sun-hee, when she was supposed to be Steve Bigin's counterpart, just refused to meet with him. So they had already slowed down the talks, and they always were aiming only at talking with the president. That didn't go well. So I think we probably are in for a period of no talks for a while. But you know, they're under pressure. They're under economic pressure. They cannot hold out forever. So diplomacy may pause. I think it will resume later in the year.
And Vice Foreign Minister Che blamed Secretary Pompeo and National Security Advisor Bolton and said U.S. is gangster-like and that U.S. has missed a golden opportunity. What is your reaction?
I think it's really a continuation of their game plan. They've been very careful not to criticize President Trump because they see him as more likely to offer concessions, such as in Singapore. So they have been very critical of, before Secretary Pompeo. The criticism of Bolton is new because he really had been out of the North Korea issue for, it seems, the last year, but now has reasserted himself. So I think they're pointing out to the president, look, we won't make any progress if you have us talk to those two officials, or if we have to respond to their demands for actual action from North Korea. We want to meet with you, Mr. President. We can resume the positive atmosphere of Singapore. We can make progress, but you have to be the interlocutor, and we do want concessions as you offered to us in Singapore.
I don't disagree at all what Bruce says, but criticism of Mr. Bolton isn't new. Okay. You know, remember the very ugly words that they used. Right. I think human scum was the way it was translated at one point. And last year, they got very frustrated and responded angrily when Bolton was talking about the Libya model, because to North Koreans, the Libya model means basically the death of the leader. So they've always seen Bolton as the bête noire, and when Bolton is the one who threatens more sanctions, they have to respond aggressively to that.
So is Choi Sun-hee the counterpart to Bolton, do you think, now?
In terms of rhetoric, maybe, but no, look, I don't think she's at Bolton's level. I'm not exactly sure what role. I mean, I know she's the vice foreign minister, but I don't know what role she's playing in advising the president.
Now, Secretary Pompeo, in response to Vice Foreign Minister Choi's remarks, the administration wishes to continue negotiation with North Korea, and it was Chairman Kim who promised to President Trump that he will not do any testing. So what do you think of this immediate reaction from the U.S. government?
I think I think that's a good response. I think it's let's keep things calm here. Please rethink your sort of low-level threats. Just as the U.S. has said it may sanction additional entities, perhaps North Korean and Chinese, they haven't done so yet. So I think there's a lot of kind of low-level threats or indications of what could happen, but they haven't implemented them yet. So I think there's don't go there, we want to resume negotiations. So I think it's a bit of posturing right now. But it could escalate if either side implements some of the threats they've
And I think by stressing that the United States remains open to negotiations, the United States maintains the moral high ground here, and in the eyes of the world, and in the eyes of the American domestic public. Most people applauded Trump for rejecting a bad deal in Hanoi, but by keeping the door open in negotiations, I think the United States is really showing that it's the adult in the room right now.
Mm-hmm. So after Hanoi, U.S. has emphasized that we're going for all-in-one approach, that big deals. So why the emphasis after the Hanoi summit, do you think?
Well, I think this is the strategy that was decided before the Hanoi summit. This has always been John Bolton's strategy of forget the stage by stage. We want to get all of it at once, and let's apply maximum pressure to get maximum results. That's always been his strategy, and he obviously persuaded the president to pursue that strategy and not to take something less than that in Hanoi. So after Hanoi, of course, they're continuing this strategy. They can't switch immediately. And I think we're going to see this, for some period of time until maybe things escalate, and then the United States might have to recalibrate.
Former U.S. diplomats, after the Hanoi summit, advised that now the U.S. should return to the traditional bottom-up strategy, whereas U.S. officials continue to say, no, we're going top-down still. So do you think we tested this top-down strategy enough? Should we test it more?
Well, I think what we've seen is that the top-down approach has been no more successful than the bottom-up. And we can either criticize the Trump administration for doing that, but to me it's always been the bottom line has been we haven't made progress in 25, 26 years of negotiations with North Korea because they're unwilling to do what they agreed to do in the past or unwilling to comply with 11 UN Security Council resolutions. So I guess now we're kind of in the game of both bottom up and top down. But what we've seen is in the past, some would criticize the U.S. for never having a summit meeting, that's where things would actually have a breakthrough. Well, we've tried it, and it didn't work any better than the past. So really, the onus is, as it's always been, on Pyongyang to fulfill its promises in 8 previous nuclear agreements, as well as 11 UN resolutions. I'm more comfortable, though, with a bottom-up approach where you have, seasoned diplomats working out what will have to be a very extensive, very comprehensive agreement. When you do things at the leadership level, perhaps it's more efficient to getting to the point where you realize that they're not willing to denuclearize. But the danger is like in Singapore, where the president may make a unilateral concession that shocks his own advisors.
What was interesting is that after the Hanoi summit, a lot of U.S. officials, Secretary Pompeo, NSA Bolton, they all came out and gave detailed account of what happened in Hanoi. What do you think is that they were very different before going into Hanoi?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think the reason for that is that Hanoi was a failure. And when you have a failure, you have to try to spin it as a success. And I'm not criticizing them for doing this, but they came out and they gave a lot of detail and explained how what North Korea had proposed was just preposterous. I mean, they exceeded. Actually, they shaded the meaning a little bit, but I think they were successful in spinning this in a way that made analysts like Bruce and me think, yeah, the United States did play the right. Played at hand okay in Hanoi. I personally think that they should have used the time better. Trump didn't have to walk out. There could have been other steps that they could have pursued. They could have pushed Kim Jong-un to see if he would be willing to accept something less than removal of all UN sanctions, if he'd be willing to give more than just a few facilities at Yongbyon. So I don't think they played it so well. Still, the spinning, they did right.
Mm-hmm. Also this week, the panel of experts reported to the Security Council that North Korea continued activities at Yongbyon complex. And Dr. Olli Heinonen told VOA that it is likely that North Korea created material enough for 2 nuclear weapons during this period, the past year. So what does this say about North Korean intentions?
Well, some will see it as it's not a violation of the Singapore Summit Agreement because they actually didn't promise to do anything. Of course, it's a continuing violation of the UN resolutions, which requires North Korea not only to not test nuclear or missiles, but also to abandon their nuclear missile and BCW programs. So, in my view, it shows that North Korea is not willing to actually denuclearize. They haven't taken steps to, actually take things offline to stop production. But again, because the Singapore summit statement was so poorly written, it's not a violation of that per se, but it is a violation of the UN resolutions.
Mm-hmm. And in that same report, there were North Korea's sanctions evasion practices were also in that report. And is it effective to call out on those practices?
Oh, I think it's very helpful to call out those practices, to identify them, to tell the world, this is what North Korea does to evade the sanctions, and this is what you should do to close those gaps. I know this speaking personally because I used to help the UN panel of experts promote the sanctions around the world. I conducted workshops on their behalf, and we explained what North Korea did and what the requirements, the obligations were to uphold the sanctions. So I applaud the UN panel of experts, and they're an independent group as well, so they have great credibility.
Mm-hmm. So my last question, going forward, do you expect escalation of tensions, and what should be the best strategy going forward, both for US and North Korea?
I think we are in a period of escalation of tensions here. Both sides have now forecast their next step. The United States forecasting more sanctions, and I think it's natural that they would try to apply more sanctions, maximum pressure, to try to remind North Korea that they face a real choice here. And North Korea, for its part, can't be seen to be giving in to pressure, so they have to make their own so-called threats. And I think they probably will test missiles of some sort. Now, they have a large variety of missiles they could test. An ICBM would be hugely provocative. Another missile test would be hugely provocative. Space launch would be less provocative because it's not exactly an ICBM, and I would argue that it's actually quite far from an ICBM, but we can have that debate another time. But they could also test short-range missiles, which they never said that they would not test. They just haven't. So I think short-range missiles are probably what we're going to be seeing launched in the next, quarter of the year.
Mm-hmm. What is the best way forward from now?
Well, I think both sides need to refrain from sort of overreacting. So I think on North Korea's part, I think the ball was still in their court. If Kim Jong-un comes out and says the talks are over, that in and of itself is escalatory behavior. Certainly, if they continue activity at the missile launch facility, they may be doing it in slow motion to try to get us to buy them back to the negotiating table. But if they go ahead and launch either a space launch vehicle or another missile or certainly an ICBM reentry vehicle test or a nuclear test, that really just kind of breaks the diplomacy. On the U.S. side, we have been holding back not only on enforcing UN resolutions, but on enforcing our own laws. The Trump administration, like the Obama and previous administrations, has been pulling its punches on enforcing U.S. laws. So we may go down the path of more fully enforcing our laws. The president last June said there are 300 North Korean entities that we have evidence for that we're not sanctioning. He could go after some of them, or even the Chinese banks that Congress believes are violating U.S. laws.
Well, we'll look forward to what happens in the future. On that note, we'll move on to our next segment.
It's still one of the worst human rights situations in the world.
In its annual human rights report, the State Department cited a range of North Korea's human rights abuses, including unlawful killings, torture, and forced labor. The State Department said there wasn't any progress on North Korea's human rights, despite its diplomacy with the United States. Now, the same conclusion was made by UN Special Rapporteur to North Korea, Ojea Quintana, that the diplomacy didn't improve North Korean behavior. What do you think is that?
Well, North Korea, has been one of the most egregious violators of human rights for decades. And in 2014, the UN Commission of Inquiry concluded that these violations were so atrocious and systemic that they constituted crimes against humanity. So certainly we haven't seen any improvement in North Korea's treatment of its own citizens since then.
Mm-hmm. And you were with the State Department for 3 decades, so help us understand. Some media reporting points out that the word egregious was taken out from this year's reporting. Other experts say, no, they were fully listed. What they did was fully listed in this year's report. So do you agree with the view that this State Department has watered down North Korean human rights violations, or did it not?
Well, I was surprised that they removed the word egregious. I mean, Bruce just used it. We would all use it. They are egregious violations. And why would the State Department remove that word? I suspect they got some signal from the White House to in line with what President Trump has been doing. He himself has been actually whitewashing North Korea's human rights violations. In Singapore, we remember what he said about that. There's a lot of countries have troubles, and this is really not the way to do to press America's norms. So I was surprised at that. And as a former State Department official, I know that officials would normally keep the same language of the previous year unless there's been some demonstrable change, and there hasn't been. So they shouldn't have removed that word.
So as a diplomat, how do you value the foreign policy interest with the core values like human rights?
I think you do it in different forums. You use your negotiations to go after your top priority, but in other forums, you press the human rights issues through the United Nations and elsewhere. You don't let up on pressing your core national norms and interests.
Mm-hmm. And this year's report also mentioned that South Korean government tried to silence the North Korean defectors from criticizing South Korea's policy and North Korea. Were you surprised that U.S. called out on its ally? And what do you think about South Korean trying to silencing those defectors?
I was a little surprised State Department called them out in the Human Rights Report, but I commend them for that. There certainly has been a trend under the Moon Jae-in administration to pressure or in some cases intimidate those that are being critical not only of North Korea but of South Korea's policy. So, we've seen actions, I think, in the media and with North Korean defectors that are trying to limit the criticism of South Korea's policy toward the North. So, I think the government has been attempting to silence or reduce the criticism of its policies.
And also this week, Japan said it is not going to submit the UN resolution condemning North Korean human rights because it wants to resolve the kidnappers issue. Also, Kim Jong-un's half-brother Kim Jong-nam's murder suspect was also freed. So, is the ongoing diplomacy impacting the human rights issues? Does all the countries want to get a piece of the diplomacy pie right now?
I hope that's not the case, that many countries are lightening up on human rights. The two examples you mentioned, I think, are regrettable. I think they probably had their own reasons behind them. Japan has a straightforward focus on its own abductees and has its own domestic reasons for prioritizing that. In Malaysia, there were probably legal reasons why one of the suspected murderers was let go. I don't think it probably was part of a government policy. But there is a context here, and part of that context is that the United States, the leader, is not itself pressing human rights at the presidential level. They do it in the form of the Human Rights Report and in some other ways. But maybe people are taking subtle cues from the White House.
Mm-hmm. Final thought, Bruce. How can we pursue improving North Korean human rights while we pursue this denuclearization diplomacy?
Human rights has to be a part of our approach with North Korea, whether it's in the nuclear negotiations, but I think certainly at the presidential level, we can't refrain from criticizing North Korea. And I agree with Mark, is that the U.S. has been really whitewashing its treatment of, at the presidential level, of North Korean human rights. Before the Singapore summit, President Trump gave three very, I thought, eloquent and moving speeches criticizing North Korean human rights at the State of the Union address, the UN speech, as well as his speech to the National Assembly in Seoul. I thought those were very well done, really stronger than previous administrations. Since then, however, we've seen, I call, a glorification of Kim Jong-un. Here's someone who's committing crimes against humanity, and he's being dubbed by the president as courageous and honorable, who loves his people. That's just flat out wrong. And Vice President Pence was scheduled to give a speech criticizing North Korean human rights on International Human Rights Day. That was canceled. The U.S. sanctioned 3 entities in North Korea for human rights or censorship activities. The list was supposed to be longer, but that was reduced by the administration. So moving forward, national security, of course, is paramount, but we can't neglect human rights because upholding them is a key U.S. principle.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, we'll end our conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture of Chairman Kim casting his vote in the election for the Supreme People's Assembly. The turnout was 99.99% with 100% approval rate. Surprisingly, Chairman Kim did not run for the body, but his sister and Foreign Minister Lee Yong-ho and Vice Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee, key players in North Korea's diplomacy with the U.S., were elected. Mark?
I think what this photo shows is that norms of democracy are actually universal. North Korea doesn't honor them at all, of course, but on paper, he's holding a piece of paper pretending that there's a real election here. But they do realize that having elections is a norm, and they should follow it. The way they follow it is ridiculous. It's an aberration.
Bruce?
When you said there was 99.99% participation, I'd hate to be the poor 0.01% that didn't vote. I think they're probably going to get a knock on the door from the security service. The fact that it was so overwhelmingly, in favor of the government shows that this really is a sham. But as Mark said, they like to have the facade of democracy. They think it gives them legitimacy in the world's eyes. It clearly doesn't. But they also react very strongly to criticism of their democracy, criticism of their leadership, criticism of their human rights. So it does show that world opinion does matter to them, even if they eventually ignore it.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Bruce, Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.